Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the AI for Good Breakthrough Days. My name is Ksenia Fontaine from the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and I have the privilege of introducing today's webinar. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we are also the organizer of the AI for Good Global Summit alongside X Prize Foundation and in partnership with 36 UN sister agencies, ACM and Switzerland, our co-convener. The goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. Like the most of the world, the AI for Good Summit has gone digital, with a weekly programming allowing us to reach even more people across the globe. The heart of the summit has been always organized around the breakthrough tracks, where we aim to connect AI innovators with problem owners to generate meaningful AI for good projects. This year is no exception, and we are moving forward with Breakthrough Days, presenting all-star keynotes, interactive workshops, project presentations, and announcements. And before I introduce today's moderator, I would like to run over some housekeeping rules. If you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab to communicate. The moderator will select and read out the questions to the audience. And we are particularly counting on your participation to create a very engaging discussion. And speaking about interactive, I have the first challenge for you. Could you please let us know where you are connecting from, which country or which city? Simply use the chat tab and make sure to send your message to all panelists and attendees. And let me do it first. So I'm calling from Geneva, and I can see people connected from Canada, New York, Dallas, Algeria, Barcelona. Wow, it's going very quickly. Milan, United Kingdom, Lausanne. Welcome, everyone. Now I would like to introduce today's moderator, Andrew Toward, Vice President of Partnerships at X Prize Foundation. Andrew, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Xenia, and thank you everybody for joining today. We've got a very interesting program today, combination of a compelling keynote as well as diving deep into the breakthrough tracks and giving you a view into all of that. So as Xenia said, I'm with X Prize, and I'm going to moderate your experience through much of these discussions here today. We're going to start here with a keynote really focusing on what is AI for Good anyway by Sasha Lucioni. Before Sasha gets started, maybe I'll give you a little background on Sasha. So Sasha is a researcher at Mila AI Institute in Montreal, where she works on AI for humanity projects spanning from climate change to bias detection. She received her PhD in 2017 in cognitive computing, after which she spent several years working in applied AI research. And in 2019, she left her job in finance to pursue her passion at Mila. She serves on several committees, including Climate Change AI and Women in Machine Learning. I do want to thank Sasha for spending some time with us this morning and for joining this conversation. Sasha, as we kick off here, I'll allow you to get connected. I don't see your video just yet.
But I'm working on it.
Excellent. And while we're doing that, maybe I'll set a little context here for the discussion. So I think the timing of this is very apropos. We've spent the last week really talking through a number of different tracks which revolve around the application of AI for some social benefit. Our tracks this year we'll talk about in the second part of this call. However, with any AI project for some social good, they always tend to mean well. They always intend to have a great impact at the outset. However, we don't always see that when the project finally realizes its finality. So I think maybe we can explore this concept and that delta between the intent and the impact these projects have, and really just explore that question of really what is AI for good anyways. So Sasha, I'll let you take the floor. Thank you again for being here, and please, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Let me just pull up my slides quickly. Here you go. So the topic, what is AI for good anyway? Just a little bit of context. As Andrew mentioned, there's been a lot of AI for good buzz. Tech companies have AI for good programs. Smaller companies as well, universities have all been looking into AI for good. And there's also, smaller scale, larger scale initiatives. And the general goal of all these initiatives is essentially to deploy the best, the most cutting edge AI and to solve critical problems. So these can be poverty, hunger, crime, health. And I've been kind of basking in this for the last couple of years. And a question came to mind, about 6 months ago. I've really started thinking about this. What makes AI good? So is it the domain of application? So is any, for example, health application of AI good? Is any application of AI in education or environment good intrinsically? Is it the problem being solved? Is it the fact that we predict a natural disaster or detect cancer? Is that what makes AI good? Is it the positive impact? So is AI for Good project particularly good because it can impact thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people? Is this what really we're going towards? Or is it the intention? As Andrew mentioned, often projects have the intention to do good, and is that all it takes, and the rest is kind of secondary? Or is it all of the above? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and since I'm a researcher, I've started doing some research. I've read a lot of papers. I've watched a lot of talks. Here are some of the people I've been particularly listening to in the last months because they have really important things to say. And then I prepared this talk for you because I think that you can really benefit from this kind of more holistic vision of AI for good in your future projects and endeavors. And I will intertwine some thoughts from these great leaders, these great researchers, in order to kind of guide all of us towards hopefully a common definition of AI for good, hopefully some principles that we can follow, or at least some things that we can keep in mind when we strive to do AI for good, because I know this is something that interests all of us. So to start with Lester Mackey, he says AI holds the potential to help us address some of our biggest challenges like poverty, food scarcity, and climate change. And I completely agree with that. But let me start with some success stories, some projects that for me really hit a home run in terms of using AI for good. There's Lester Mackey's group actually at Stanford who called Statistics for Social Good, and they have this really great bottom-up strategy. So essentially, they divide and conquer. So they contact different stakeholders, national, international. They reach out to them. They ask, how can we help you? How can we use statistics or AI to help you? They distill the problem. They try to figure out what technology can be used. They figure out the data that's there. Essentially, they do all this kind of legwork in order to define these projects, and then they deploy them along with relevant stakeholders. And they document all of their findings on the website. So for me, this is a really great approach. It's very bottom up, but it works really well. They've had some very, very impactful projects. You can check them out if you want. Stats for Good at stanford.edu. So this is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it as the Computational Sustainability Network with Carla Gomez, they do it in the opposite way. They go with the techniques that they master, for example, stochastic inference, sequential decision making, pattern decomposition. So they start with really the things that they do well as AI researchers who are interested in sustainability. And they see how they can use these techniques. This is actually a subway map of all the different projects they work on, which is great because it shows that some projects need only one technique. That's enough to do, for example, plant phenotyping. But other ones need several techniques working together. So impact of dams in the Amazon needs a lot of different techniques. Bike sharing also needs 4 different approaches. So they really have a more top-down approach. So they start with what they know they can do, and then go down. So this is interesting because it's actually really complementary to Lester's work. A very recent success story for me in AI for Good has been Michaela van der Schaar's group in the UK. What's interesting in this case is that they took a tool that they developed for other applications before, essentially for hospital decision making, and they deployed it for COVID-19. So what they did is they created a tool for NHS, so that's the UK health authority. They developed a tool for administrators and doctors and hospitals to predict essentially the severity of their patients. So based on different criteria, age, sex, comorbidities, et cetera, it's to help essentially decision makers decide whether, to allocate an ICU bed, whether they need an intubator, a ventilator or not. Sorry. So essentially, it's really like a tool for them to get hands-on decision making. What's really interesting is that this was deployed super fast because essentially they took something that they created for other diseases that were more slow-moving, cancer and et cetera, and then they really deployed it in a very quick turnaround time in the UK. And they did it in partnership with the NHS, making sure that they developed in a way that they could deploy it in hospitals without having this huge learning curve. And it actually is used right now, and has potential to save thousands or tens of thousands of lives. So once again, huge success story. But as another one of the researchers I've been looking into says, while AI for Good programs often warrant genuine excitement, so I'm genuinely excited about this work, they should invite increased scrutiny. Good intentions are not enough when it comes to deploying AI for those in the greatest need. So on the flip side of the coin, we looked at these great success stories, but what are some cautionary tales that we can look at to see what can potentially go wrong even when good intentions are at play, and AI for Good is the objective. So AI for Good can have unintended consequences. Maybe all of you know at this point the Compass project in the US. I think the intention was really great, was to try to alleviate some of the pressure on the judicial system in the US and to try to predict essentially what some of the people who are sentenced currently, whether or not they have a probability of committing crimes in the future. Now, it was trained on all sorts of data, on historical data, and a ProPublica research project that analyzed it realized that most of the features that were used for this kind of prediction was actually race. So African-American inmates were seen as more likely to commit crimes in the future. So obviously not good, right? And this was a system that was actually deployed and used in courtrooms all across the country. So this is a cautionary tale of intentions are there, but obviously the way it was done was not the way that benefited the most people. Another example is more recent, actually. This happened a few months ago in August. Because of COVID in the UK, once again, they had to cancel final exams for high school students, so for people who were going to university. And since they had to cancel these exams, they thought, okay, we'll train a machine learning algorithm to predict results instead of actually having kids pass tests. And they had, once again, several features, and notably the historical notes of the student themselves and of their school. So these were the two main criteria used. And essentially, they attributed marks to students. And based on these marks, they could go or not to university. So, massive decision. And huge bias, because good students in less good schools with less academic excellence were heavily penalized versus mediocre students from very excellent schools who had this unfair advantage, right? And so it created a lot of noise in the UK. Finally, they went back and questioned their decision. But once again, great intention. They wanted to make sure that the stress of COVID was not amplified by these exams. Another cautionary tale. Finally, there was a system meant for detecting poachers in Africa in wildlife reserves, and it was deployed. It was working more or less, but they figured out that kind of the problems that have been identified in out-of-the-box facial recognition algorithms, that they don't work very well when it's dark, and often they don't work very well on darker skin tones, were amplified in this poaching detection system. So it had a lot of false positives, and often it was very hard to justify a false positive. Like if someone was falsely accused, it was hard for them to say, no, I'm not a poacher, I was just there, or because they didn't know what the features used for the algorithm were. So they just know that this person was classified as a poacher. So the local authorities have this kind of tag, they have a label that this person is a poacher without any kind of explanation of the decision made. And so the person accused couldn't really justify themselves. And so finally it was put on hold for the moment. They're working on improving it. But once again, great intention. The way that it was deployed, maybe a little less successful. And nowadays, we have all these AI algorithms that detect, that track biodiversity, that predict how whether or not we're a good fit for a position that we apply to. Nowadays, for example, they can diagnose COVID based on X-rays, right, in hospitals. And and poaching as well. So we have all these kind of these systems that are deployed in various areas that make decisions or that propose decisions, predict things, and we don't really know how this happens. And so often also AI for good projects attract a lot of attention, a lot of positive buzz kind of, and then less so for the actual impact. So there's less follow through. So we hear about these great projects, groundbreaking, climate change, poverty, etc. But then what happens? What's the actual impact? So there's kind of two use cases for me. Sometimes in the best case, we see AI as this magical fairy dust for positive impact, which arguably can be good for the domain, but there's no concrete without solving any concrete problems. So we see this AI as like a savior of the humanity, but after that there's no follow through. So this is kind of for me the best case. And in the worst case, we're using AI to experiment on vulnerable populations and without giving them any benefits of the technology. So for example, if we do have false positives, if we do have these kinds of algorithmic decision making. So for example, if someone does get sent back to prison because some AI told the judge that they're more likely to recommit a crime, that's huge. That can be someone's life. That can be someone's whole livelihood. They get sent back to prison. That's 20 years of their life gone. And so in this case, we have to really be careful when we deploy AI. So this is kind of the horizon, but how can we make AI for good better? And this is what I'm really here to talk to you about. We can start with asking the right questions. So Timnit Gebru is a researcher in AI and ethics, and she says we need to figure out, are we asking the right research questions? What are the pitfalls? Because then AI has hopes of being more impactful. So what are the right questions? Well, let's start with what the problem is. So I think that many AI for good projects define a problem that's not necessarily the real problem that they're trying to solve. So often, we're tackling climate change, we're solving poverty, we're reducing crime. This is the real problem, right? This is what we're aiming towards. But we solve a proxy problem. So for example, detecting poverty from satellite imagery, identifying extreme weather events based on radar, facial recognition for poaching. These are kind of proxy problems because it's not necessarily going to stop climate change to identify like a hurricane. It definitely is going to help something, but it's not necessarily going to stop climate change. Detecting poverty based on a satellite image, it's arguably good to know where there are poor areas, but is it really helping solve poverty? And once again, with a crime, what are we what's the problem we're solving? Just predicting whether someone is more likely to commit a crime based on data of people who have been stopped, and so that data can be biased as well. So honestly, it's really a proxy problem that doesn't address actual reducing crime. And often we don't have any solid data, so we use surrogate data from either other places or based on some older historical trends. Like for example, for poverty detection, it can be some census data from 10 years ago. It can be just based on average income. It can be lots of things. Aggregate data often is high-level data, and this is what we use for deploying the projects. So you can see the problem. Are we sure that the solutions are really similar in both cases? Are we sure that the surrogate problem has the same solution as the real problem? I'm not sure. And often AI is touted as the solution because it's great. AI, can do lots of stuff. We've got all these deep neural networks. It's amazing. But is it really the right solution for the problem at hand? Say you do figure out the problem that you want to solve. Is AI really the solution? So often AI solutions are actually really complex and expensive to develop, very technologically demanding, hard to deploy. Often it's, you deploy it, for example, on the cloud or in your own servers, and it's used by people on the ground. They don't have access to the actual algorithm. They don't really understand what's going on. They just have some kind of, okay, this is good, this is bad. But there's a very big gap between people who develop the problems, the solutions, and the people who actually need to use the technology. And also, constraints. Do they have the technology in order to actually visualize something? Do they even have computers that are powerful enough to run these machines in the context that you're aiming for? And often people jump to AI before trying simpler solutions. Maybe some a statistical, more simple random forest approach can be used. Maybe it can even just be a pure, something like textual analysis, maybe just like keyword search instead of convolutional neural networks. I mean, there's a huge gap before you can jump into training a deep neural network from scratch. And as I said, AI for Good initiatives, I believe that they're truly well-intentioned, but they raise some important questions that often don't get covered in enough depth. So, for example, who defines the problem to be solved? Is it the AI researcher? Is it the company they work for? Or is it the people who are going to be using this eventual tool? Is AI the right solution for this problem, or is it just because we've got a convolutional neural network lying handy and we want to use it on something, so this is why we're using AI? Where does the data come from? What metrics are used for measuring progress? Is it accuracy? Is it F1 score, which, for example, will track false positives and false negatives? Are you sure that you're tracking your progress in the way that makes sense with regards to the situation? Who will use the solution proposed? Who will maintain the technology, right? There's all these questions that have to be thought through before even starting a project, before even training a neural network. These are all really important things to take into account. And also, finally, who will make the ultimate decision? Is it the algorithm or is it a human? And if it's both of them, how is that decision made? How is the decision explained, for example, in terms of transparency to a human who will use that information to make their decision? So, I mean, we have to think through all these questions before doing AI for good. Another aspect, I don't know if you noticed all of the initiatives, I said it at the beginning of my talk, they're really hand in hand with stakeholders on the ground. The NHS, it can be all the different organizations that Stanford worked with. Computational Sustainability Network also often always work with the partners on the field, so including the right people. And here I can turn to a quote from Shakir Mohammed, who also works in ethical AI, who says, "The only AI that empowers and works for the benefit of humanity is truly global AI, and making AI truly global will not be easy." And so it's true that it's complicated to work with stakeholders who often don't really understand the technology, who don't have the background necessary for understanding the algorithm itself, right? So we really need to change the way we talk. We can't just use technical terms anymore, but it's really, really super important. So on one hand, NGOs, for example, if you're working with Red Cross or UNICEF, Médecins Sans Frontières, they have real-world expertise on global problems. They'll tell you what the problem is. They'll literally say, whatever toy data set you're using, that doesn't have nothing to do with what we're actually facing out there in the field. So they can really tell you the problem that you need to solve. They can also help deploy the AI solutions so that they have the biggest impact. And actually, like in a lot of countries, populations trust organizations like the Red Cross, sometimes more than local governments, because they've been there for a really long time. They've proven time and time again that they can get medicine, they can have outreach or educational programs. So people really trust these organizations, and working with them gives an immense amount of credibility to any AI for Good project. And they can also give you feedback about your AI, because say you train a model that does some kind of prediction or classification, and you get 99% accuracy on your data set, and then you give it to, for example, the Red Cross, and they're like, wait, this doesn't work. This is not the categories that we have in real life. It's not just black and white. There's also like 20 shades of gray between the two. Maybe we should be looking at a multi-class classification problem and not a binary classification problem. I mean, those are probably not the terms they're going to be using, but this is the feedback that you're going to get, and you can go back to the drawing board and retrain your algorithm. Also, an important part of this is actually empowering the people who will use the AI, because if there's a big gap between these kind of AI geniuses, these AI wizards that develop this technology, and the people who will just kind of get it and have to use it, there's a big gap there that's not necessarily, doesn't build trust, doesn't build cohesion. So it's really important to include and empower the stakeholders and the populations who will use this AI technology. And this should be done from square one, like when you, instead of training a version of your algorithm and then going to the Red Cross and then saying, hey, I can predict blah blah blah, I can predict whether someone's going to go get their vaccine or not, and then maybe you should go back to the drawing board and ask them, do you need to predict whether people are going to go in for vaccines, or is there another problem that's more important? Maybe it's the way of getting the vaccines to the villages that's really the real problem, because people are willing, but they're not willing to go 50 kilometers in order to get it. There's all these problems that maybe are something that we didn't really think of. And actually, the problem with that is that most of AI comes from Western hubs, right? What do we know about getting vaccines in a rural country across the world from us? We don't know that. We can pretend to know. We can even read some articles and say, hey, BBC says this is an issue. And maybe it is, maybe it truly is, but maybe there's a bigger issue in the region that you're looking at, or with a specific NGO that you're looking at. And we have to make sure that we're not the ones that are imposing our view of AI on other populations. And so we have to be inclusive and engage voices, cultures, and ideas from places that we don't necessarily have contact with in our daily lives. So it's really a big effort, actually, to go and to kind of find the right people, to build a relationship of trust, to really keep the conversation going, and to explain what you're doing to non-specialists. This is something that I've been working on cultivating for a while now, because I realized that the way I talk about my science, about my research, doesn't percolate, doesn't really hit the way I want the people I'm talking to. And so I've started to, simplify the way I talk about AI. I've started to use more, less sciencey terms, more, less math or less statistics, and more kind of real world language that people can really get behind. And in order to include people and create an inclusive AI, we all need to be talking like this about our work, even though it's really hard. And finally, I mentioned this briefly, but AI for good projects are rarely a one-shot deal. You're not going to solve poverty with a single, AI algorithm. It's usually one piece of a puzzle, and most of the other pieces of the puzzle are not going to be AI. They're going to be other things. They're going to be things like outreach, like decision-making, policy-making. They're going to be convincing people that this is the solution to be used. So it's really important to think about the big picture. And about domain knowledge, because yeah, sure, we're the AI scientists, but we need to ensure that our algorithms are functioning properly and own them in a way that they can be used. And so committing time and effort for maintaining deployed AI for good projects on our end is really important to ensure their perennity. And maybe like you've trained your algorithm, it's great, it solves the problem that you need, it works well, et cetera, but then people are hesitant to use it because they don't understand how the decision is being made. So it's up to you to work on making it more transparent and more explainable, so that people can really get a grasp of what it is, what kind of algorithm is making a decision that will impact their lives. And this brings me to the last principle. It's being transparent. So being transparent about your algorithm, about the way it works, about the solution you've developed, the features that it's using, all of that. And Joy Buolamwini is an amazing researcher. She works a lot on the intersection between actually art, AI, and kind of governments and policy making. And she says, as companies, governments, and law enforcement agencies use AI to make decisions about our opportunities and freedoms, we must demand that we are respected as a people. And for me, transparency is the foundation of respect for anyone, for it could be personal relationships, professional relationships. For me, from square one, you need to be transparent. And so what does that mean? That means that we should be clear about the risks and the benefits of the AI solutions. We shouldn't be saying that, hey, we made this magic potion that's going to solve all our problems. No, it has risks. There's always risks. And for example, I was very, very happy to see that NeurIPS, which is one of the major AI conferences, starting this year, they made it mandatory for AI researchers to submit a statement about the societal impacts of their work. And that's major, because even if you're working on, a classification approach or some theoretical AI algorithm, it's important to think about down the line how this can impact society. So we should think about both the benefits and the risks of the approaches we develop, both in the short and the long term, because for sure, if you're creating, some new loss function, it's easy to say, but this is just a local thing, it's not going to really impact, but maybe that's in the short term. But then if you use that loss function in the real world, it can have real world impacts in the long term. And when promotion of the project is done, when you say, hey, when your company says, well, we did an AI for good project, we're, going to tackle climate change, we're going to solve poverty. Well, they should be pretty clear. You should be pretty clear about the scope and the limitations of your project. It shouldn't be, no one's going to solve that big a problem with a small algorithm. You have to say, we have a data sample from here, we have partners from there. This is the scope of our project, and be very clear about the fact that it's not going to cure cancer. And one of, for example, the aspects that Joy works in is checking for bias. And so she did this amazing project called Gender Shades about how biased facial recognition technology is. And that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, because it's in everything. In any algorithm, there's going to be bias, and we just have to be transparent about it and understand what's going on. So this involves checking the data that the model was trained on. Is it balanced? Is it representative? Who labeled the data? Is it experts, or is it crowdsourced for people who don't really understand what the problem is? Using Mechanical Turk can be great if you want to label a bunch of data, but often you don't explain the task at hand. It's just kind of a simplified version of the task to simplify the labeling process. But is that really representative if it's a complex task? Does the model do equally well in all categories? Darker skin tones, men and women. So these are things that need to be tested before deployment to make sure that you're not inadvertently causing harm and kind of discrimination. Also, what are the features used? So often, when we train a deep neural network, it's really hard to say this is the feature that makes this prediction the way the system predicts the way it does, right? It's often not one single thing. It's a multitude of things. But we should be working to make our algorithms more explainable. So you can say it's 50% this, 30% that, et cetera, et cetera. So at least you know that the features being used are relevant to the task at hand. Or is it using features that shouldn't be used in this particular context because a neural network does not know, that you shouldn't use, for example, skin color to predict crime. You can't tell an AI that is not a feature. It's up to us as people, as researchers, to add that constraint into the algorithm and to have the checks and balances to make sure we're not using those kinds of features. Also, what happens with false positives? What happens if someone does get accused of, being likely to recommit a crime? Are they assumed guilty until proven innocent? Because that's kind of what was happening with Compass when the ProPublica article came out. There was no second guessing. There was no check and balance there for false positives, and that's major. And also, who makes the final decision? So I'm a big fan of human-in-the-loop AI because I feel that we're not there yet to deploy AI systems that are just going to go off and make decisions about human lives. I think it could be a data point, and sometimes it's an important data point, but it shouldn't be, the only data point we're using to judge whether someone should spend a life in prison. It shouldn't be that straightforward. So I think it's important to kind of create a balance between decision making, algorithmic decision making, and human decision making. And so the takeaway messages that I want you to kind of keep in your mind is when you're doing AI for good projects, good intentions for me are a given, but it's also often important to ask the right questions, include the right people, and to be transparent. And kind of a quote that really stayed in the back of my mind, again from Mark Latonero, is he says that the deeper issue is that no massive societal problem can be reduced to the solution offered by the smartest corporate technologists partnering with the most venerable international organizations. So even if you do, check all the boxes, just keep in the back of your mind that it's really hard to solve climate change or, tackle poverty with AI. It takes so much more than that. And so this is why it's so important to have a more holistic vision and to think kind of outside the AI box. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha. That was very insightful, and I love that last quote. We're seeing that so much in the different projects that we're XPRIZE or that AI for Good are promoting here and sponsoring, that need for inclusion of all different skill sets to address a problem. So we have some time here for some Q&A. So I open up, I see we have a few questions that come in through the chat, so I welcome anybody to ask some more of those questions. I'll get the process started here, kicking off with a couple questions here that have come through. We'll start with, you've talked in your presentation a number of different recommendations or principles around how we attack these AI for Good projects and avoid some of the pitfalls of them. Any ideas on how we could possibly enforce that, we as a collective community?
I think that it's important to have frameworks. So actually I think right now these kinds of frameworks are being developed for AI in general, but it's also still a work in progress. So how do you, make sure an AI is not biased? And so I think that we can really piggyback on that process for AI for Good. So while these discussions are being had, to make sure that the AI for Good use cases are being taken into account. So for example, areas like health, areas like poverty, like climate change, so that we're really taking into account the specificities of these areas, and that the discourse doesn't get dominated by financial decision making and things like that. So having a seat at the table and being clear about the specificities and why are AI for Good projects, why should they be part of the discussion? Why should we be focusing on them? And we have started to see principles of ethical AI. For example, we've got the Montreal Declaration, etc. But they're not like a checklist. I think what it really would take is to have a kind of a really something that you can use systematically when you're deploying an AI project, so you know that it's not just being transparent, it's ensuring that the features are accessible to, for example, a person using the algorithm. So it's really concrete steps that are part of a broader principle.
Excellent. Great. Thank you for that. Next question that came through the chat was kind of referring back to the beginning of your presentation, and the question reads as follows: with all your comments about AI, the quote AI for good buzz all over the place, is there a risk of AI for good washing, or worse, is this already happening? Therefore, putting off potential serious partners and funders. What's needed to cut this risk short?
I definitely think it's happening. I think that, I see a lot of events that are like tech for good, and it's like finance, and then it's like, AI for good, and it's just, convolutional neural networks. And I see a lot of that happening. And I think, of course, there's going to be hype. I think that that's kind of, that's where AI is at right now. We're at this, I think this is kind of like the new awakening with regards to the limitations of AI. I think more and more we're going to realize that AI can't do this, AI can't do that, and keeping the discourse centered on projects that are real and are impactful, and so leading by example essentially, because you can't go on and keep telling people, no, that's not AI for good, no, your event's not tech for good, right? But you can lead by example, and you can deploy projects that really put their money where their mouth is. And so I think this is up to us to say, okay, like, I followed, all the best practices. I deployed these projects. Now I can safely say that my project is AI for good, and promote it, knowing that it's really impactful.
I love that. Hopefully we've got a few projects here that we'll be talking about later that fall into that category of really showing what we can deliver. Next question, specific, and this relates to what you were talking about earlier about the enforcing the principles, but maybe focusing on a certain audience of that. Specifically in the case of big companies who have big budgets and talent pools, it seems to be really important that they're aware of all the things that you're talking about here, i.e. proxy problems versus real problems. So how can they frame all that involvement under ethical considerations and fiduciary duty so as to protect the most vulnerable populations?
So this is something I've been grappling with myself. So I've always kind of stuck to being in research and academia, and it's true that it's easier. Things seem clear from the ivory tower, but when you do get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's a lot harder than you think. And so, for example, even asking the right questions, it's really hard once you get to the real, like the real work. And so I think that in big companies, what's important is to kind of work with academics, work with people who maybe are a bit naive. Maybe I'm a bit naive. I totally accept that. But so, big companies have their own ways of doing things. They have their own, limitations. They have their own things that they're trying to maximize or minimize, et cetera, et cetera. But by creating partnerships between research and academia, I think we're all kind of getting pulled in the opposite directions of where we have a tendency to gravitate. So researchers like it when, the data is clean, the project is well defined, et cetera, and we know exactly how to solve it. In the real world, it's never like that. And so some corners can be cut just because the real world is a lot messier. But if we really work together and connect research and industry, I think that's where the potential is.
I love that linkage. That makes a lot of sense. Next question, and I'll put a little spin on it. The question was, how can AI systems be audited to assert if they are, quote, AI for good or not? Or I know that's a large question, but maybe have you seen attempts where there have been attempts to give a scorecard or what have you to implementations as to whether or not they meet that bill?
So I haven't seen an AI for good scorecard, but I've definitely seen an ethics and bias scorecard. It's interesting because it actually entails a lot of things. Because in order to say something meets the criteria or not, we have to define the criteria, and so far we haven't systematically defined the criteria. So, but there have been, for example, I've seen consultancies and even, for example, legal practitioners doing some kind of like AI audits, and of course, big consulting companies as well. So I think that it's really, instead of trying to audit, we should be working towards some kind of ISO certification of AI. I think that would be a very good direction to take, even though it's kind of wishful thinking, but just having a way of certifying an AI system, even based on a limited amount of criteria, would definitely help everyone, because we have a way of certifying bridges, of certifying airplanes, of certifying lots of things, but not a facial recognition algorithm. And so, and we can, in that case, like if we think more programmatically, we can have unit tests, right? We can say, okay, we're going to run your facial recognition algorithm through these tests and make sure it has the same score on, dark skin and light skin, on men and on women, at night and during the day. So you can have these kind of checks and balances once you define the criteria that you're optimizing for. So I think we should take a step back and focus on that. And once we've defined those criteria, then we can start auditing and giving scores.
Makes a lot of sense. Hopefully, we've got some folks around in the audience here that could participate in that kind of activity.
Yeah.
Then we had a few questions coming in through the globalization of AI in terms of, one, which is maybe two lenses to look at it, some of the challenges, particularly, if we can't come to agreements on political issues or, privacy issues, whatever, between, say, U.S. and China, how could we incentivize or come to a similar type of agreement around AI? And that's kind of part one. Part two, a follow-on question to that is, are there examples where there is good examples of globalization, where different AI projects or initiatives have gotten together to leverage each other's work product to increase the scope?
So actually, I don't know of any existing initiatives. I think it would be useful. Most of the initiatives are pretty regional, or sometimes, one institution that is on one continent that is deploying in another continent. But in order to be global, I think, actually, I can send the ball back to your court. We need an international organization that will federate this. And I think that ITU and other UN organizations they already have part of that know-how, right? Because we don't necessarily have it as researchers. Private companies don't necessarily have it, but these kinds of organizations that have a history and a baggage can really be the federators. And they could really make the connections and ensure that things are done in a correct way to prevent, bias, to prevent, developing AI applications that can't be deployed in the field. So honestly, I see them as the hub of making these initiatives. So, but I don't know of any existing ones so far.
Well, I guess that's a challenge for us to put those together.
Exactly.
Next question reads as follows. What about already present problems that AI only laid bare? Bias and discrimination are prevalent in topics like recruitment or crime fighting. When AI is applied to these areas, these issues drift to the surface because suddenly we have the data. So we blame the AI for being biased. Isn't that blaming of the technology? Aren't we blaming the technology for a human problem?
For sure. And I think that what, for example, the Compass Project brought to light is that the judiciary system is biased. It's not the AI. Obviously, the AI is just trained based on the data. And for example, ProPublica was saying that, most of the people who do get rearrested are African Americans because there's a bias in the policing system. And so, it's like a transfer of bias that percolates up. What I think is interesting about AI is that it can make us realize our own biases. So, for example, there's a really interesting project by MIT called the Moral Machine, and there's all these dilemmas around self-driving cars, autonomous driving. Do we go right and hit an elderly person, or go left and hit a baby in a pram? So which choices are okay? And the answer is that there is no good choice, right? And they made an interesting website where you can answer a bunch of questions as if you were the autonomous vehicle. So do you choose the grandma or the baby? And then at the end, it gives you a scorecard of your own biases. And it's interesting because every person who has done that, in my experience, are like, no, I'm not biased against old people. No, I'm not like that. And then you can see how biased people are. All the people who took that test are, and then. So the answer to autonomous vehicle ethics is that there is no right answer, and we just have to be clear about the features that we're using to make those decisions. And I think that's where explainable AI and transparent AI really come into the loop, because of course we're not going to make 100% unbiased AI, but if we can show to a human what are the features being used to make this decision, then we can at least make it part of the equation. Okay, the algorithm says 90% this, but it's based on these features which are acceptable or not given the problem, and that's up to us.
Thank you for that. It makes perfect sense. Next question. You talked about transparency. I think some of the audience wanted some further clarity around transparency. Is this to do with the data or something other?
So there's different approaches to transparency. It's actually really interesting. There are approaches that really have to do with the data, but often it's the way we represent the data. So what kind of features are we using? So what are the features that we're allowing the system to use to make the decisions? And so now more and more there are systems that you can kind of, for example, there's a system called What If, where you load your data and then you have your task is where you want to predict, whatever, category A, category B. And you train your neural network and it gives it the output, and then the system shows you what would happen if you remove this category. If you remove this category, what would happen not only in the accuracy of the model, but in how well it's doing to represent both classes, for example. So say your initial accuracy was super high, but the minority class, it was really bad and there was a lot of false negatives or false positives. And then you can see, like, you can uncheck a box and you can say, okay, don't use this feature anymore. And then you can see what happens if that feature is not present anymore. And you can even have proxy features. You can have a feature that represents both, race and gender. For example, in health, there's a researcher in University of Toronto who does really interesting work, because in health, you can't just ignore gender. You can't just say gender is not a feature in this data, because it's obviously important for a lot of things. Same thing with race, because there's actually some pre-existing genetic conditions that are a lot more prevalent in certain racial backgrounds than others. So she says you can't just ignore this, but you can anonymize the data. You can aggregate the data in a way that race is not the only feature being used. So I think that's really important, because you can't just pretend that all the uncomfortable features are not important. You can't just say, okay, let's just ignore all of these and make our decisions on other things, because then you're not using all of the data. So data is a massive part of the problem.
So that's actually, we had questions along the same lines there. First, just one was the role of data in AI for good. So in the grand scheme of things, how much we should focus on the data element to it. And a related question that came along there was, could some global data commons be a useful solution? Is it the aggregation of those data sets, or is it more focus needs to be on removing the bias or cleaning or what have you of the data?
So getting the data is really major. For example, I'm part of an organization called Climate Change AI, and I'm actually, this is something we've been looking at. So say we have all these amazing machine learning researchers, AI researchers who want to solve climate change. Like, where is the data? And most of the data is in regional, kind of dispersed in different databases. Often it's in formats that are hard to read for machine learning, that you have to take a spreadsheet and convert it and things like that. So I think pooling data, having a data lake, would be a really massive part of the endeavor. Metadata is even a bigger part, because say you even do have all the data from all these different places, you have to make sure that it's interoperable, that you can use data for I don't know, droughts in this part of Africa with droughts in this part of Asia. Is it really the same criteria? Is it the same even the same units of measurement? Is it Celsius or Fahrenheit and things like that? So I think the geek in me really thinks that metadata is really important. If we had a system that could, AI could detect which fields are similar, which ones can be linked. So there's a massive engineering effort to be done, and a commons would be really useful, but it can't be just like everyone throws their data in and then we just pretend it's all, we can use all of it. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think a certain ownership for that data that goes in there to ensure that the quality and the metadata, what have you, is key to that. We clearly have a lot of questions because you've got a lot of people interested here. So next one up, if you don't mind, you mentioned that we need to include more diverse voices and perspectives in order to ensure that AI projects are more effective and ethical. How do you think we can be more inclusive and listen to more diverse voices in developing AI projects going forward?
I think what I said about communicating is really important, and I'm definitely not perfect on this, but making sure that we talk about AI in a way that doesn't scare people off, because obviously people think that AI is only for crazy super math geniuses, or for people who can program, or for people who are rich, or whatever. People often have these prejudices, and part of this discussion should really be, AI is not magic. AI is just a way of computer learning based on things it's seen to predict things it hasn't seen. Like, I mean, talking about AI in a way that's like this, and also more representativity. So I think that once people realize that AI does not just belong to rich industrialized nations, that does not just belong to these huge companies with all this money, I think we definitely need more success stories that come from places of less money, less resources. So initiatives that are really kind of more grassroots, and that have been tracking locusts in the fields in their region, using a network that they downloaded from GitHub and that they retrained on pictures that they took, things like that. And the more we hear about these kinds of initiatives, the more people can own AI for good, and can understand that it's not just some white unindustrialized application. So I think we need to really promote projects that are not from the Western world and are not from the rich world.
I think, speaking on behalf of somebody who's been involved in the breakthrough tracks through this week, I think we've definitely seen that as a recurring theme, and fortunately had a lot of representation from across the world. So I think maybe making baby steps in that area, not quite there, but certainly progressing. A couple more here. Generally speaking, where do you see AI for good going in the future?
I think we're going to see this dissemination. We're already starting to see the fact that there are more and more people owning AI. It's become more democratic, so more people can get involved in AI in general, right? So it doesn't take much to train a neural network. It doesn't take much to understand what the impact is. So I definitely see a democratization. And I think that more and more organizations that were hesitant to get involved are now getting involved. So, for example, in Montreal, we had a hackathon last year with some local NGOs, and then we had a lot of trouble getting data because essentially, for example, homeless shelters or soup kitchens, we wanted to help them use AI to help. For example, for the soup kitchen, it was to take the food they were getting and distribute it in a way taking into account what food goes bad and what food doesn't. So, but we had a lot of trouble because they didn't really understand the value added. Like, they were like, why would we use AI if we're having trouble? We're all hands on deck. We've got people lining up every day. Like, what is this AI going to help us? But we did a first hackathon. We had 3 or 4 data sets, and then this year we're working on another one. And we have more people on board because they saw that we created a system that could be deployed in a soup kitchen that could predict, based on tomatoes and pasta, what could be made. And we really had fun with these projects. And so I think that, more and more, once we get more product, people from the actual world getting on board, that's when we're going to see impact. Because so far it has been a bit of an ivory tower effect. So I'm really curious to see what happens when more people get involved and it becomes kind of this big babble of AI for good.
To that end, by the way, I mean, a big piece of what we've seen over this last week or so is really just sharing information about those types of projects as inspiration for future projects, or as projects for people to get involved in. We'll be talking about this later, but we do have a Slack channel for set up here. And somebody can maybe plug it in the chat, whereby people can connect around different projects. So love to give those projects a bit more of a voice, like I said, whether they're active ones to engage folks who are on the call, or whether they're just inspiration to create similar ones. And I think that's a good segue to what I'll make our last question here, which is really about this community that's on the meeting here. And so we have a community here, and if you could give them a call to action as to how can they get involved in AI for Good initiatives, what to look for, what inspiration would you have for them? Just please task them to join that fight.
Yeah, definitely. Step one for me is identifying what you're good at and how it can be used. So it doesn't have to be AI. Actually, I think a lot of the things around AI for Good projects that often get overlooked, things like, even graphic design or communications journalism. If people are good at communicating, if it's a non-technical skill, it can actually bring a lot of value to AI for Good projects. So above and beyond, so identify what you're good at, how it can be used, and there are actually a lot of initiatives once you start looking into it. Like if you search for your city and tech for good or some meetups and things like that, you'll be surprised that a lot of, especially larger cities, already have existing initiatives, and sometimes it can be a non-technical initiative. So for example, if you find volunteers who are working with a local NGO or a local soup kitchen or the government or whatever, see how AI or whatever skill you can leverage can help them. And so often, there's always something already there. So what I don't like about a lot of AI for good projects is they assume that they can just solve whatever issues at stake without doing the homework about how it's being solved now. Like, how is this being done by the people who are doing it without AI? So that would be the second step, doing your homework and figuring out how you fit into the puzzle. And maybe AI is not the solution, which often is not. And then say you do identify, some skills that you can apply in a context, and AI is actually useful. Then get a team going, reach out to other people in your area or even internationally, because nowadays we're so virtual, and get them involved, and then start to make a timeline, start to organize yourselves and get data and things like that. So actually, the Stanford group has a really good kind of best practices on their website about reaching out to people, how to reach out to people, how to communicate about AI and things like that. And then finally, how to deploy the project. Like, they have the whole timeline up there. So I find that that's a good approach to follow in getting involved in AI for good.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And although we didn't plan this, it aligns so much to particularly to XPRIZE's view of the world. And what's very relevant to this is that seeing that same need and the same need to identify other projects that are out there and parties that are doing that are part of these causes and including them. XPRIZE is actually putting together a global AI alliance, where, much like we did with our pandemic alliance, we're inviting parties who have solutions, who have problems, who know about the problems, to get together and convene around how we can apply AI to them. So to everybody on the call, you'll see some announcements on Wednesday about that. But I think it very much aligns to what you're saying, Sasha, in terms of being as inclusionary as possible, and not assuming that any one alliance or new organization is going to reinvent the wheel or come up with that silver bullet that nobody else has come up with before. So I'd love to see how aligned we are, and we'll be talking more about that later. But in the meantime, I do want to thank you so much for your words of inspiration, your patience going through all of these questions. Certainly you had a lot of interest from the audience. So on behalf of everybody on the call, I do thank you for that. And yes, let's pick up the torch where you're leaving it and challenging us here on your presentation. So thanks again.
Thanks for listening.
So as we transition forward now, we're actually shifting to a different format, which is one focusing now on the breakthrough tracks. If we can cue up some slides here to take us into the next section. As you, I'm sure everybody on the call is aware, we got together, and as Xenia said at the start of the call, a big piece, a focal point of the efforts of the sessions is those breakthrough tracks, where we're really collaborating around identifying meaningful projects that effectively move the needle around the SDGs. Now, we didn't attack this generically, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a background as to what the journey has been like and what's taken us to this point forward. So the first is, if we could go to the breakthrough track slide. So the first was now many months back, determining where the focus of the breakthrough tracks would be this year. And XPRIZE and our panel of experts around us got together to decide where would there be areas of focus, but very much building on work that had already begun. XPRIZE has identified for quite some time now the need for and the role of AI in the areas of, in particular, gender equity and future of food, and has been cultivating for them for some time. As a matter of fact, on Wednesday, you'll also see some further announcements and upcoming plans in those areas. And then, of course, the pandemic hit us, and we all did what we could to highlight our response or to get together in our response around that. So these seem like obvious choices, culminating on work that already started, as well as responding to today's needs. And so the breakthrough tracks really were divided into these three categories. For those that haven't been here before today, you'll see that they're gender equity, future of food, and collective pandemic intelligence. So what we did, if we can go to the next slide, on a roadmap, is the first thing we did was, of course, in defining those tracks, is we collaborated with some brain trusts who you'll see, we'll introduce you to who those folks are as we go through this session. A collaborated brain trust to really define where those tracks are, and within those tracks, some key themes that we would focus on. So even, gender equity is a pretty broad category, and we wanted to make projects and submissions as focused as they could be. And again, as we introduce the different projects going forward, we'll highlight for you what tracks they're from. So that was the first step. Then we did a call to the community. Many of you here are on this call that we asked, please submit your projects that might move the needle around one of those tracks and within one of the themes in those tracks. We recruited a number of experts in those areas of gender equity, food, and pandemics, who would then mentor these different projects and help them both get ready for this week that we've had here this week, as well as further advance the thought process around their project and how they want to launch and impact, et cetera. We then, or more to the point, the Brain Trust and experts had a very difficult job to narrow down from all the submissions we received down to 3. Those would be the 3 that would be workshopped over the course of this last week. Like I said, it wasn't an easy task. A lot of great ideas came through. We actually have ways in which to also surface those projects that didn't come through. We'll talk about that a little bit later this week. But for today's discussion, we want to focus on the 3 areas, those 3 projects within each track that we surfaced. Next, we workshopped them. So starting last week, we of course gave everybody on this call a chance to convene around those different projects, hear what the projects are about, understand what the gaps are, provide their advice, their guidance on the direction and where they could focus, how they could be more impactful, identify the gaps associated with those projects, and then take it from there. So that's that brings us to today. So between today and tomorrow, we're going to give each of those projects. So there's 9 projects in total, 5 projects today, 4 projects tomorrow, spread across those different tracks. We're going to give each of those projects a chance to tell the world about them. So all of you will receive a short presentation from each project, and then after that, it'll be followed by a short Q&A, and then we'll move on to the next one. The moderation of this will be a combination of myself and plus 2 of my colleagues. Haneen and Caroline helped me within 2 of the other tracks within gender and food. And so we'll let each of those moderators or facilitators help introduce the project, give you some thoughts about them, and take it from there. So first up will be gender. And I have a pleasure of introducing Haneen to you. And Haneen, you're in good hands for the next little bit here. Haneen, why don't you take it over?
Thank you so much, Andrew. Hello, everyone. My name is Haneen Khalaf. I lead the gender initiatives at XPRIZE Foundation, one of which is aimed at closing gender data gaps forever. As Andrew mentioned, gender equity has been a focus of XPRIZE for a while now, with projects such as Women's Safety XPRIZE or the Water Abundance XPRIZE. And we do have an exciting announcement on Wednesday, so please be sure to tune in so you can hear about what's coming up next for us. So today, we'll be hearing from 2 gender equity teams from the breakthrough tracks. These are the two teams, the Global Judicial Integrity Network and a team from Umeå University and Uppsala University from Sweden. So, but first, I wanted to thank the people who are responsible for getting us to this point today. So first, I want to give a massive thank you to our Gender Equity Brain Trust. They've been with us since February, as Andrew mentioned. They've been developing this track and crafting the breakthrough themes. And so the 3 teams that you'll be hearing from today and tomorrow are solving issues within those breakthrough themes. So Andrew mentioned, we'll introduce those very soon. I also wanted to thank our gender equity experts. So they took the time to meet with all of the teams that submitted projects and mentored them to get them ready for this event and the workshopping around their projects. And they did not only meet with the teams that you'll be hearing from today. As Andrew mentioned, there are a lot of amazing projects that came through, and we will share how you can get involved in those as well. So the moment we've all been waiting for, it's an introduction to our first team from the Gender Equity Breakthrough Track. In a second, I will welcome Roberta Solis from the Global Judicial Integrity Network out of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And the theme that this team addresses in their work is how can AI systems be designed and used to help human decision-making be more gender inclusive? So very fitting that we just heard from Sasha about all of the AI applications in the judicial system. We'll hear a little bit more today. And though you'll only meet Roberta today on video, we want to mention all the other team members who helped make this work a reality, including Tatiana Balisova, Melissa Evans, Harry Chang, and Christina San Juan Serena. So welcome, Roberta. The floor is all yours. And once you're done, we'll open it up for Q&A. So please be sure to add your questions into the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone with us today. As Hanin very kindly introduced me, I'm Roberta Solis, the Judicial Integrity Team Leader at UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which acts as the Secretariat of the Global Judicial Integrity Network. The network is an initiative to support judiciaries in addressing existing and new ethical challenges in line with core international principles, including the ethical use of AI in justice systems. Since its launch, the network has already reached 145,000 stakeholders in 190 countries. On behalf of the Judicial Integrity team, I would like to present to you now our project to develop a set of global recommendations for judiciaries on addressing gender issues in the design and implementation of AI systems. So why is this a problem? Gender bias and discrimination may arise in multiple forms in the justice system, particularly in cases of gender-based violence. Female imprisonment globally has increased by 50% since the year 2000, reaching around 800,000 female prisoners in 2017. 35% of women worldwide have experienced sexual violence or physical violence by an intimate partner, and cases which manage to reach a court hearing are weighed down by the history of discrimination against women. With our project, we aim to positively impact the lives of women in the justice system around the world. Unless the underlying data and algorithms are designed and assessed with an explicit focus on gender, AI solutions designed to assist judiciaries could have the perverse effect of continuing to propagate or of deepening discrimination and biases. The issue is as complex as the use of AI in judiciaries can be varied, and each application presents different risks and vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the use of AI tools must consider dimensions of gender bias and gender discrimination. Otherwise, women will face unequal access to justice and other threats to their rights, including the right to a fair trial. In terms of threats to the right to a fair trial, we have the example of predictive justice applications. These applications can be used to suggest case outcomes to judges or provide recidivism ratings for probation hearings based upon biased historical data. Eventually, these applications could lead in legally binding decisions if we also factor in the risk of automation bias. In the realm of case management, we have observed a shift from purely automated solutions to AI-based solutions. Cases of gender-based violence are typically urgent, and AI systems must be taught to correctly recognize and prioritize them in order to prevent physical harm to those involved. This can have a big impact on access to justice for women, because if cases are not treated in the right way, women may be discouraged from seeking judicial protections, at the very least. So our proposal, the solution we propose is to develop, launch, and maintain a practical framework of global recommendations for judiciaries on how to develop AI systems to ensure that they do not replicate or deepen gender-related issues. This framework would include a set of global recommendations to identify how AI can be used by judiciaries ethically and considering the gender implications, a repository of good practices in open source format, continuously updated with a collection of case studies, solutions, experiences, and data sets. And finally, a self-assessment guide for judiciaries with existing AI applications to evaluate their applications against the global recommendations. The product we envision is a collaborative effort between the judicial community, AI experts, and gender experts. Beneficiaries will be able to learn how gender considerations can be overlooked or misrepresented in data, laying the foundation to develop solutions that do not propagate gender bias. And this will be important for both judiciaries building AI applications in-house and for any developer wanting to develop products for judiciaries. We anticipate that these products will reinforce each other. Continued curation of the open source repository will ensure that the recommendations and the self-assessment guide remain relevant as our understanding of bias and AI evolve over time. This proposal would have a positive impact on judiciaries and therefore on the communities they serve. AI has come to stay in the institutions of justice, as we just heard with the keynote speaker. And with the solution we propose, we have the opportunity here to ensure that the use of AI does not lead to the reproduction of gender biases and discrimination. This project seeks to ensure that the justice system includes all women in the development and deployment of any AI applications, and that it leaves no one behind. We look forward to the questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Okay, so everyone who is listening in, if you have any questions, please don't forget to submit them in the Q&A portion. So I can get us started because I don't see anyone sending any in yet. So I know you touched on the needs that your team has right now. So can we talk a little bit more about the specific asks you have for this community? So how can everyone listening now rally behind you to make sure this project launches and is a success?
So maybe if you can go back to the slide on the timeline. I think that also gives an idea of where, in which part of the process everyone can participate and help us with this. So the first phase of the project would be a desk review, a comprehensive desk review of practices around the world. This is something we have started, but we would need additional help to do this in a more ambitious timeline. So we would be open to partnerships with law clinics, with researchers, with those with AI and legal experience to participate in this part of the project. Of course, for the consultations, we are looking for the expertise of the community to tell us how these applications can potentially lead to problems. And this would be the expertise from the AI community, the gender experts, and others with, especially those also with experience with gender and AI, to help us understand the issues that can come up with this, all these different uses of AI in the judicial system, as well as potential solutions or experiences that exist of trying to address these issues. So we can collect not only this for the recommendations, but also for the repository of potential solutions. In the validation phase, we look at a potential pilot testing of the recommendations and the self-assessment guide for judiciaries. So it would be also very interesting to count on the expertise of those with an experience with auditing systems to identify, to evaluate the systems against the benchmarks of the recommendations. For launch and dissemination, I think we would also be looking at the community to help us disseminate this more broadly into the community. Because through our network, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have already reached 145,000 stakeholders, 190 countries. Our last high-level meeting with almost 50 chief justices or presidents of Supreme Courts from around the world had over 700 participants. So we already have a good reach within the legal community with the judiciaries. But as I mentioned, the idea with this project is also that this becomes a valuable tool to developers, to the AI community. So they also know how to work with judiciaries if they're looking into that area of work. So partnerships in disseminating this would be also very important. And of course, with the curation of the open source repository, I think we would also look for the expertise of the community in helping us curate this. So it really is a useful tool, a tool that can evolve as understanding and knowledge and breakthroughs in the technology also happen, because we can keep track of that very well in the legal community. but we know that judiciaries walk at a very different pace from how technology is being developed. So it would be good to hear from the community and have those insights and that assistance with the curation. So maybe judiciaries know what to look for in the next steps. So I think these would be, very interesting areas for collaboration, the type of needs that we would be looking for. And I think that the more engagement that we have from the digital rights community, from civil society, from AI experts, gender experts, the better these two can be, the more useful, the more impactful worldwide.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It sounds like we have a lot of opportunity for the people on the call to get involved. So I do know that the Global Judicial Integrity Network has already drafted a number of recommendations for the use of AI in the judicial system and other types of recommendations. So can you tell us a little bit about how you'll incorporate these recommendations into your existing set of recommendations and how that actually will help with the success of the dissemination?
Good. We have, in these 2 years of existence of the network, we have already developed 5 knowledge products or policy setting documents that are international standards for judiciaries. One of them was guidelines on the use of social media by judges, which is another area of great concern for ethical dilemmas for judges. With that one, we also had a collaborative process to develop those. So the guidelines were developed by judges, by other stakeholders in our network, and they were then disseminated through the network, first being launched at a high-level event that we organized, a panel we co-organized with the World Bank, and then at our high-level meeting last February that I just mentioned. And it was readily disseminated to 118 judiciaries at that event. So very quickly, we can distribute this to judiciaries. And an effort that we also do in the network is to translate this into different languages to also assist with further dissemination, because we know that a lot of this sounds very nice in English, but around the world, not everybody can speak English or read English well, or even translate text in English well into their own systems. So translation is also another key part of our dissemination strategy. In the case of social media guidelines, we have been working also with judiciary, so they translate the guidelines pro bono, making this even a greater ownership process for them. We also have a package of judicial ethics training tools for judiciaries that at the moment we have almost 60 judiciaries around the world that have already committed to implementing and are already implementing that package of training tools. So this is another way that we can further disseminate our products, working with judiciaries to assist them in the implementation. This group of 60 judiciaries could be likely candidates also for the pilot testing of the AI recommendations in case they are in the process of either developing or adopting AI applications. 2 of these jurisdictions we know that are in this process. So to give an idea of the range of the countries we work with, we have in this group Brazil and Papua New Guinea. Both are in the process of developing predictive tools to help sentencing by judges. So they would be the natural candidates for the initial testing of the guidelines.
Great, thank you so much. So I can't believe this, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in. Are there any other UN offices, like regional or otherwise, so New York, Geneva, et cetera, that are involved in this already? I know you mentioned 190 countries, so I'm assuming yes.
Yes, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, has local offices, regional offices across the world, and we work with them, with our colleagues in the field as well to maximize the impact of all of our initiatives. The Global Judicial Integrity Network is part of a global program within UNODC, the Global Program for the Implementation of the Doha Declaration. which works with all of our field offices and regional offices, so we can amplify the results. Also because our colleagues in the field are also closer to our stakeholders, our beneficiaries, and in a lot of cases that facilitates the process.
Great. Okay, and last question. You could address bias in predictive justice, yet discrimination being happening prior to it through predictive policing. How could you expand and deepen your impact in the former by linking up with colleagues examining bias in the latter?
I think that's also an added advantage of our, specifically of the global program in which our initiative sits on, because another component of this global program is a component on prisoners' rehabilitation. And our colleagues work directly with prisons, corrections offices, and ministries of justice. So all that we are proposing to develop here and we're going to develop in this project can also be used and later shared and disseminated with those institutions. So I think what we are trying to accomplish here also has the potential for a spillover effect throughout the whole criminal justice system.
Okay, I have to sneak one more question in because it's so good. Since it will be a recommendation, what will be the motivation for potential users or the judiciary systems to use it? This user said that they can imagine that most of them will do anything possible not to be assessed.
Well, that's why we said self-assessment, because then we work with their will to be assessed. But I think that also the positive side of developing this through a UN process is that this become really international standards for member states of the UN and their judiciaries. And I think that brings a different level of engagement and will to implement, because then we would be talking to judiciaries about UN standards for their work. And they already have that, for example, with the Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct, which is the main international standards for judicial conduct, ethics, and integrity in the judiciaries. And it's widely accepted by judiciaries. One, because it was developed through a UN process. And two, because it was developed through a UN process involving the judges. It was the first set of international standards aimed at judiciaries that were developed by judges. So we follow this procedure in all of the products that we develop in the network, because this is sort of a true and tested approach that helps with judiciaries actually implementing, adopting, and engaging with these standards.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Roberta. I can't believe we're out of time already. It goes by so fast. But if anyone would like to reach out to Roberta or the team, we do have our Slack channel. If you haven't already joined it, we'll also drop in the channel where you can specifically communicate with Roberta and their team. And now it's time to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Caroline Colta, who will introduce us to our next team. Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. This is great. And as Haneen mentioned, my name is Caroline Colta, and I'm a product manager at XPRIZE. And as Andrew mentioned at the outset, XPRIZE has been working in the food and agriculture domain for approximately 2 years now. This October marks a year after we published the Future of Food Impact Roadmap. It's a report exploring the necessary breakthroughs to transform food systems for the better. So please check our website to check that report out, and stick around until Wednesday to learn more about XPRIZE's work in the food and agriculture space. And as you might have guessed, today I'm honored to be introducing 2 Future of Food teams who will be presenting their projects, Grow Next and Project Farm. But first, I would like to thank our incredible group again of Food Brain Trust members who have also been involved from the very beginning, charting the 3 different topics that we wanted teams to submit projects for, and working with the teams since then. And I'd also like to thank our experts who mentored the teams from all around the world Thank you both to the brain trusts and experts for giving us your time and helping out the teams trying to move the needle on future food and sustainable food systems. And without further ado, I know we're all waiting to hear from our teams. So I'd like to welcome up Maurice Hoendurdos from Grow Next. Grow Next's work aims to address the theme of how might we use AI and machine learning to establish the correlation between growing practices and the nutritional value of food. So Maurice will be speaking on behalf of his team today, but we also wanted to honor other team members who won't be on stage with him, who helped make this work a reality, including Jubarash Paudel, Ramchandra Paudel, Giorgio Moses, Emil Dirksen, and Tajis Mullenbelt. Maurice, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Maurice Hoendurdos and this is Grow Next. My name is Maurice Hoendurdos. I'm Grow Next Data Science Lead. And at Grow Next, we want to have a substantial contribution to feeding megacities with fresh, healthy food produced around the corner. We do this to serve the great challenges: food safety, food security, and food sustainability. We believe that fresh food production needs a radical change. We believe that this is especially the case when considering sustainable development goals. A lot of food production is unreliable, unsafe, and damaging. These food issues are the most pressing in megacities. There are over 33 urban megacities with over 10 million inhabitants with a rapidly growing middle class. This middle class will grow at least 50% in the next decade. These middle class people need fresh food. Think about cities as Singapore, Bangkok, Shanghai, but also Bay Area, Toronto. Our mission is to provide carefree on-site food in megacities with a focus on food safety, food security, and food sustainability. We achieve this using our Grow Next growth modules in an efficient, modular, and connected approach without using GMO, without using CRISPR or pesticides, and while minimizing resources. This is the new thing in fresh food production. Here we see the important parts of our solution. Starting at 1, we grow in semi-autonomous on-site growth modules while monitoring and measuring using IoT devices, connected through a cloud infrastructure and with the aid of machine learning and AI. We are very much supported by local fresheneers through our app and connected using the central control hub. Oh, excuse me. We are connected through our central control hub. This allows us to stay in contact with our local fresheneers. And this also allows us to grow enhanced quality crops. At the center of this all is our core novelty, created using AI, which are our dynamic digital recipes. In contrast to all other production methods, our on-site Grow Next modules, in combination with our dynamic digital recipes, tick all the boxes, such as nutrition, safety, freshness, and taste, all due to our carefree on-site modular approach. We go for the highest quality possible. That's why in our go-to-market strategy, we first focus on high-end markets, such as 5-star hotels, that can provide us that challenge. As we succeed there, we can earn back the investment and start scaling up to communities and until the services will become more feasible and at lower cost for communities around the world in those mega cities. Scale will drive value with data science as an accelerator. Our aim is to increase the natural food components of plants for a healthy diet for the millions of people in megacities. Production can be just around the corner, and our approach will have increasing social impact as we scale up, from jobs for fresheneers to the availability of fresh and healthy food in communities. While other production methods might be cheaper, their indirect cost to society, such as the use of pesticides, are highly concerning. GrowNext Growing as a Service eliminates these costs while ensuring product quality, food safety, food security, and sustainability. Most importantly, we do not just offer a crop. Our Growing as a Service model includes on-site fresheneers for carefree growing and maintenance. We have an ambitious timeline. In the coming period, we will focus primarily on developing a robotic super sensor, a digital integrator, and a library of digital recipes, as well as setting up the Fresheneer Academy. Most importantly, we will pilot our concept in Amsterdam and Singapore. Besides financial investment, we are looking for support and expertise on the following areas: product development, global talent, and go-to-market. We really seek engineers and knowledge for our micro robotics and sensor technology. We also seek experts for climate zoning, for growing different crops in a limited space. And while we have a team of experienced data scientists, IP specialists, and biologists, we also look for talent in plant science and advanced analytics. Finally, we can use go-to-market support. We seek local connectors in the megacities, for instance, in the hospitality industry, in the real estate, and in the municipalities. With that, we at GrowNext thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Maurice, for the presentation. And we'd love to hand it over to our attendees for questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A. But first, Maurice, I can start us off with one question. If you can tell us about some specific examples of how you envision this project impacting food system transformations in the future. How do you see that impact playing on food systems?
Very good question. While our solution is technically advanced, so our first impact will be local for those high-end markets that are willing to pay a premium in order to get that real good quality food. But as our solution becomes better and we become better and our products become cheaper, and we will also start serving, for instance, hospitals and campuses, which will allow local communities with opportunities for employments in kitchens and food hubs. And of course, our end goal is providing local food, no longer a need for transport, for CO2, and of course, the accessibility to that healthy local food in the communities where the food hubs end up.
Great, thank you for that. And maybe picking up from the keynote from Sasha's presentation this morning, your project seems to work a lot with local diets, local preferences, as well as growing practices. And I was wondering how your project ensures, speaking about transparency from this morning and inclusion, how do you include voices into your technology? How does that work out to make sure diets are relevant?
Well, our data analysis is very much focused on growing those plants. So in a way, we have no bias issues there. But of course, in terms of nutrients, we need the help from, let's say, leading scientists in biology to identify what's good and what's healthy, and also local preferences. And if you look at the local communities, there are often many products that are already decent locally. But they do not always have access to, let's say, the high protein or high nutrient vegetables that are normally imported from abroad. And we hope that by bringing these best vegetables to more locations, that we can serve that community. And in a sense, we are not really dependent on a lot of bias, since our data analysis very much focused on our own measurements in our growth modules on our own crops.
Wonderful. And some questions are starting to come in through the Q&A. And one of them is asking about whether you see potential implementation of AI combined with blockchain through your project. And maybe we can expand that better. How do you see your AI technologies working with other advanced technologies in this space to make your project more impactful?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to know that there are several areas where we use AI. So we use AI to monitor our crops. Think about convolutional neural networks that identify whether the crop is sick or how much it has grown for the past day based on image data. At the same time, we use multivariate analysis to find out what really influence the growth process of a crop. We want to grow better than anyone else by knowing the plants a lot better than anyone else. And of course, we apply advanced analytics to forecast the yield and moment time to harvest. At the same time, because we want to do it remote controlled, on site, near our clients or near the communities we reach, we definitely need a cloud-based infrastructure. So I would say any cloud-based advancements will help us in the future of doing this better. And of course, our knowledge in terms of dynamic digital recipes could also be shared with greenhouses or other growers in the world in order for them to learn from those aspects to also grow more nutritious or better food.
That is great. And the questions keep coming in. One of them is asking if you have first crop examples which have improved through your recipe process. And a follow-up on that is, what scale of improvement do you need to justify being one of those leading crops that you work with?
Well, currently we have 4 crops for which we have a prototype dynamic digital recipe. Those dynamic digital recipes were first created on publicly available data and some other like scientific sources, etc. And we know that in hydroponics, it's often possible to grow at least 30% better or more crops. At the same time, we still need to test out our recipes. We have been in contact with traditional growers who were very much impressed by the quality of those recipes. But our next step are those 2 test locations where we're gonna test them out in real life, to really prove that those recipes work.
Great.
Could
and
you,
I have, sorry, go ahead.
Could you repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, the second part of the question is, what scale of improvement do you need to see to justify including a crop to your existing crops? So does the crop itself need to showcase some potential of scale for it to qualify?
Well, let's say in our starting approach, we do focus on fast growing greens, simply because growing very large vegetables or vegetables with a very large time to harvest is now not feasible. So our current crops are focused on greens that are grown quite quickly, but opposed to many vertical farms, we do not only focus on leafy greens. People are not going to be fed by only eating lettuce. So we do focus on greens that have higher proteins, such as spinach, or high nutritional values, such as kale. So at least at first, we do need to focus on fast-growing greens that are also not really big plants. But of course, as we scale up better and as we are able to reach sometimes 30 or 50% better, not even only in yield, but better crops, of course, we can expand our horizon.
Great. And unfortunately, I only have time for one more question, but there are like 5 coming into the chat. So I encourage you to look at that after and answer them and take them. But the question I would like to leave us with is, what is GrowNext's position on open sourcing? That is a question that came in through the chat.
Well, we are not a charity. We are a company with a goal of feeding those local communities. But this is, as said, an expensive and technical solution. So at least at first, we we need to make sure that we protect our dynamic digital recipes, as they are the core of our competitive advantage. But our aim is to reach those communities. So I would say in the future, we are definitely open to sharing knowledge or finding out how we can reach communities better and improve food safety, security, and sustainability in cities with our solution, of course.
Great, thank you, Maurice, and thank you for the presentation. And as I mentioned, there's still some questions in the chat and in the Q&A that I didn't get to, mostly asking about inclusion and inclusivity of local communities. So please take your time and look at those in the Q&A. And with that, thank you again. And please reach out to Maurice and his team on Slack if you have any resources you want to share with the team, or if you want to collaborate with them. And now it's time for me to hand this back over to Andrew, who will introduce the next team.
Thank you, Caroline. So yes, I'm now speaking to you in a different context, which is as a facilitator of the Collective Pandemic Intelligence Track. And I've had the honor of working with the teams as we've gone through this week on that front. The project I'm going to be talking about is COVID Sense. We'll give it a chance to present as COVID Sense. But first, as with the other tracks, we wouldn't have gotten to where we are today without some help and some guidance. And so I do want to call out and thank our brain trusts, who, of course, as I said earlier, have helped to shape the direction of where we focus, have defined the themes within pandemics that we focus, and really provided that thought leadership and guidance. And I also want to thank our experts, who then worked with each of these teams, including the one that you're going to be presented to right now, to really just guide them on the approach and the project and how we can engage a community together to get it going. So thank you again for all of their effort in getting us to this point. The team project I'm going to introduce you to here right now is called COVID Sense. And it will be presented by Leontios Hadjileontiadis from UAE. This project that you're going to hear about falls under the theme which we created within the Pandemic Intelligence Track, called How Data and Evidence-Based AI Models Can Be Used to Help Avoid Misinformation and Panic while minimizing economic impact and maximizing health outcomes. Leontios will be the one presenting, but he does have a team that have done the great work that he's going to talk about here. So do want to call them out as well as co-contributors to this. And those are Herbert Jelinek, Asan Kandukar, Kinda Kalaf, Ernesto Damiani, Vasilis Charisis, and Dimitris Lakovakis. So I want to thank all of them for their contribution, and we're going to let Leontios guide us through what COVID Sense is up to here. And then, of course, as with the other tracks, we'll jump into a Q&A that follows. So Leontios, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I will just share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all for this opportunity to talk about COVID Sense, which is a smartphone-based initiative for fighting COVID-19 spreading. And my name is Leontios Hadjileontiadis, and I'm a professor at Khalifa University of Science and Technology in Abu Dhabi, and also the principal investigator of COVID Sense. Actually, what we try to do with COVID Sense is to solve the problem of using data and also evidence-based AI models in order to identify as early as possible the COVID-19. And this way we can inform the stakeholders in order to stop the spreading, avoiding the misinformation and panic, and also to proceed with the optimized economic impact and health outcomes. So our solution actually starts with a collection of metadata and self-reporting health status data that relate with early symptoms of COVID-19. And we back up this information based on the recording of physiological signals, like the breathing sounds, the cough, the heart rate, and also GPS location. And these are analyzed with advanced machine and deep learning algorithms in order to devise a COVID-19 high risk, low risk, or medium risk index. And this can be use as an input in order to provide feedback to the relevant stakeholders for handling this in the best way. So you can see here that we have the front end and the back end, and everything is communicated with a mobile phone. But why we are going to this perspective? We are going to the sounds, the breathing sounds, the cough, because we have an effect of COVID-19 on the system. So we can see here the lungs as it is healthy, and you listen sounds that are different. And as the disease deteriorates, so this gives us a lot of information regarding the status, but also we want to see what's happening with the immune system. So the modulation of the immune system is connected with the autonomous nervous system, and we can see this modulation with the reflection in the heart rate variability changes. So
heart rate variability examines the tiny, imperceptible changes and patterns between heartbeats. Our advanced algorithms analyze these precise times between heartbeats and detects activity from the nervous system.
So in that point, we try to use the smartphone in order to have a massive data collection and to arrive to many people around the world. So in this perspective, we created the CoviSense application, which is now available currently in the Google Store, and the pending is the license for Apple Store. So we can see here that there is a profile that is written based on the consent form, electronic consent form. And also at the same time, there is a part of the application that starts collecting the data. So we have the reporting that goes to the symptoms that is self-reporting about how is the temperature, how I feel, what is the level of pain. I can have the breathing based on the guided scheme here. You can see also here the sounds, and also you have the coughing, the same concept behind. I can have the heart rate variability based on the camera of the mobile phone by putting the finger behind. And all this can give me a feedback with the statistics back to the user and also the stakeholders. So in this situation, we try to use deep learning architecture, but also combined with advanced signal processing using higher statistics and also the MEL coefficients combined, and also 1D and 2D CNN in order to have personalized training. And this can create a fusion of the meta and self-reported data and physiological signals. So actually what we give back to the user is the opportunity to self-manage his health status, and also his spatial distribution of high-risk places, and at the same time information about call for action and guidelines for emergency call, the nearest test center, and also any first action has to respond. For the policy maker, we have all these kind of statistics, and that can help him in order to increase the effect of the health impact. And as you can see, also we go for the persons, but actually we affect the whole society. And this can be evaluated based on the tool of Europe, it's called MAFE. So what is important for us, as Sasa mentioned, is the ethics and privacy and security by design, because this is highly important in order for someone to adopt the solution. We already have the national IRB from UR committee, and also we try to identify which are the latent variables inside the models that can create a bias in learning. So we want to penalize learning that is based on these parameters towards a fair, transparent, and ethical AI. But why is worth launching this application? We saw what's happening with the similar initiatives like Apple COVID-19 Screen Tool and also COVID-19 Sounds app. You can see here that are some benefits that we have with the CoviSense, which actually includes the immune system and also the behavioral and spatial model that are not included in the previous approaches. The impact actually we try to do is to empower the people to self-manage their health status. We want to transfer all this to the level of the people and also have this inclusiveness and explainable AI with this index. But at the same time, we have a multi-scale approach because we have different levels of micro, meso, and macro level from the user to community and central authorities in a global local perspective that also give us the opportunity for scaling our solution. And at the same time, we create these repositories of the data that can be used for follow-up research for the patients that already recover or the patients with comorbidities, where we can follow them in the long term and see what is the effect of the COVID-19. If we can see here as a roadmap, we are now launching the version for the Apple We have some data that we already train our models, and we have the first version of that in December. We'll increase the accuracy base and increase data coming from the application in a bigger audience, and also want to expand this outside UAE in different countries and different continents. And then finally, we can have a market entry point around July 21 in different scenarios of B2C, B2B, B2G, and even platform as a service solution. We are a team of 16 people of different specialities: academia, clinicians, health policy maker, manager, researchers, developers. And it's a combination, a combined effort between California University and Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leontios, for a very thorough presentation. So we now, just like with the others, will open up to Q&A for anybody that has any questions. I will get us going here with a few we've got already. And maybe we'll talk about next steps in scaling. I believe you alluded to in your timeline looking for opportunities to take this out of the UAE, which has already been implemented, and scale it up. So can you talk to a little bit for the audience that's here as to what that looks like in terms of if you were to make this available to other countries? And I understand it's in the UAE, it's been implemented as a government-led project, but do you envision the same as you go to other countries? And what would you look for as you look towards scaling it and creating partnerships that allow it to get more reach?
Yes, Andrew. Actually, what is the model, as I said before, sorry.
And while you're pulling up the slide, like I said, for anybody that has any questions they'd like to submit, just please do it on the Q&A on the Zoom.
Okay, can you see here? It's okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So as I said, we have different models for that. So for B2C, we actually want to have a freemium model in order for people to download the application and have all the aspects of that. But for B2B, B2G, and PaaS, actually we have different scenarios according to the delivery of the service that we give. And we try to see also if we can have funding from different sources, like funds from academia or for bodies like European Union or venture capital, even if they want to invest. And for example, the case for B2B can be a pharma company that is interesting to see what is the effect of the medication to the people based on the concept that affect also the respiratory system. For example, the COPD, asthma patients, CVD patients, patients even with a neurological perspective like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. So all this, how affect the medication, and this can be traced based on the data and the behavioral change we can see from the CoviSense application. And the concept of the government is exactly how it can optimize the policies, because they have information that is very dynamic and at the same time can be scalable and can be visualized through a dashboard that we're going to use in the context of fast decision, and also the assistance of some AI models for prediction.
Okay, and I think just building on that, I know earlier in discussion you had alluded to ambassadors that you would look for to take it to new markets. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, this actually I want to ask people if they want to serve as ambassadors in their country, because what we want to do is they join the effort. They can be of different categories, like health policy makers. They can be frontline worker, researcher, a former patient, social media influencer, and everyone that wants to be a member of the CoviSense community. And the role they have to do that is to assist in the ethics approval, because it's quite hard to achieve if you are far from the country. And also to increase the dissemination, so we have a lot of downloads and users in the specific country, and also can be part in the advisor board of the CoviSense if they have, for example, different experiences in policy making of the researcher, and can collaborate in the acquisition cohorts and definition, also can collaborate in the research, and we can have a co-creative model of the final product. And this is the first thing that we want to have. The second is we can have access to historical health data. So meaning that if we have a medical health record of bioacoustic signals, and even anything that relates with the heart and anything else that will be available. from patients that are already asymptomatic or symptomatic and ones with a chronic disease. So as I said, we want to have combination between the COVID-19 and different comorbidities, underlying comorbidities. So this will give us the opportunity to transfer all the learning that we have from COVID-19 to other cases and deal the chronic disease and see how this perspective will be implemented in the long term. And we propose also the federated learning for this perspective in order to avoid you taking the data from the place where it's archived, in order to use locally the data with the cross-silo federated learning. So in this way, they will not leave the data, the premises where they are collected, but the nodes of the learning will be updated, and then we'll have a better outcome. So it's a combination of federated learning with centralized learning in the cloud for the beginning in order to refine the model. And then this model will be applied on the device, so the user will not send any data anywhere, just the device will decide locally about the outcome.
Thank you.
And
I think
if we combine this with, we ask actually, but actually we offer also. So we offer the opportunity for the ones that want to collaborate to have access to the database, access to the training model, also to the community of Ecovisense, and they can also have a say in the shaping of health policies. We can have joint publication, co-creation experience in this research. So we actually have this mode of donation. So we need to be a part of the research and also a part of the solution based on the donation of your data and be a member of the Ecovisense community.
Thank you. Actually, you took the words out of my mouth because I knew there was a question that came through around data sharing, and it's exactly what you hit here. So, and I'm sure you've already generated some very interesting data from having already deployed this in the UAE. So look to extend that to this community. I do see there was other questions that unfortunately we don't have time to get to, but we do have the Slack channel, and there's a channel within the Slack workspace for this project. I encourage everybody to hop on it if they haven't already done it. The link is already there on the chat, so you can ask the Covidsense team any more questions or maybe connect on topics such as this and data sharing. So thank you, Leontios, and we'll look to collaborating around this on the Slack after the fact. So with that, I will then now hand it back to Haneen, who I think will take us to the next gender project. Haneen?
Thank you, Andrew. So next up, I'm very excited to introduce you to the next gender equity team. It's a team from Umeå and Uppsala universities in Sweden. It's led by Hannah Devini. So this team's project addresses the theme focused on identifying technical ways to define, detect, and evaluate algorithmic gender bias. So Hannah's team also consists of Henrik and Jenny Jorkland, who helped bring this project to fruition. And without further ado, please help me welcome Hannah Devini.
Hi there. Let's just get this screen shared. So, hello, my name's Hannah Devini. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Computing Science and the Umeå Center for Gender Studies. My research focuses on gender and natural language processing. We interact with natural language processing systems every day. It's in our voice assistants, our search engine results, predictive text, automatic translation, and it's also a part of the systems which we don't see, but which affect us anyway. Natural language processing helps fuel algorithms that decide who gets a loan, who gets hired, who gets parole. And this is important because the systems have been shown over and over again to be subject to very human biases. Amazon, for example, made a bunch of headlines 2 years ago because they were interested in making an algorithm that would more efficiently weed out unsuitable applicants to jobs, and they failed because they started from this flawed premise that machines are somehow neutral. Machines, in fact, can only know or do what we tell them. This concept is often referred to as the maxim of garbage in, garbage out. So a computer's prediction can only be as good as the training data we give it. This is exactly what happened with Amazon. Historically, like many companies, they had hired and promoted men at disproportionate rates. And because the data, or the text data specifically, the CVs and the performance reviews about their existing employees and previous applicants systematically differed for men and women because people talk about men and women differently. The machine learned to make similar predictions to these past hiring practices, and Amazon couldn't fix this, so they did the responsible thing, and at least they say they got rid of it. But this is only one example that we know about, and it's only a bias that was found because someone noticed a pattern in the output in the development phase of this technology, and when looking for reasons why. So it becomes really clear that if we want to use these technologies, which we do because they can save us a lot of time and effort and money, we want to make sure we can trust them. So how to do that? Most approaches focus on fixing the algorithm, making adjustments so that the output is less like what it was historically and more like what we want it to be. Our proposal is that we also need to fix the data. If we put less garbage in, there should be fewer tweaks required. And I'm so sorry about my cat. There should be fewer tweaks required, and in order to do that, we need to know what the data looks like, which is difficult because the training sets for natural language processing are these huge amounts of text with millions and millions of words. So our goal is to make it possible to critically examine the content with something of an eye towards the power structures behind them. We need to ask ourselves, how are different groups represented? Who is left out of this data? What might that mean for models which are trained on this data? And what effects might that have for people who encounter these models? How might they be harmed? To answer these questions, we use a technique called topic modeling to sift through the data to find the groups we're talking about. Our method is for understanding the implicit biases in training data for natural language processing systems, which should hopefully let us make positive changes, such as removing stereotypical content or injecting more and better content for underrepresented groups. So far, we've done a proof of concept for English and Swedish, using gendered groups with the categories of interest being men, women, and non-binary people, but we expect it to work just as well for other dimensions of oppression, such as race or class, and importantly, to allow insight into the intersections of these concepts. Fundamentally, we think that fairer data can lead to fairer models, and that we can do this by reducing the sheer amount of harmful algorithmic decisions and by countering our own stereotypical views. Remember, we learn biases from each other with our language. This doesn't stop just because that language is produced by, for example, your autocomplete and not a person. We plan by 2021 to have a working version of our tool public, including a topic modeling system better optimized for our purposes, and a companion guide to help users think through identifying and engaging with the power systems at play in their data. Our asks are primarily around collaboration. We're academics and we know how to develop and share a methodology, but we'd really like to make something which is accessible to a wider number of people. So we particularly need people interested in using this to investigate their own data in languages that we don't speak, or in the interest of particular social groups. And we've had a few people reach out about these. We're also interested in consulting with someone with more user experience in order to make this tool as easy as possible for anyone who wants to pick it up and use it regardless of their previous expertise. And maybe most importantly, this issue of garbage data creating garbage algorithms affects all of us. We have to live in this world we co-create. So something everyone here can do is to please keep having these discussions. These technologies aren't just going to go away, and we need to be really careful about what we put into them because that goes back into the world. So thank you all very much for your time. And before we get to questions, if we don't answer yours or is anything you want to follow up on, please feel free to email us.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so I just want to stress how urgent this is. So can we talk a little bit more about the massive impact that this tool could have on the world?
Sure. It's like kind of hard to, because it's in so many of these things that we don't think about. There's been research on automated translation. Google Translate got dinged because the original research was looking at Turkish, which has neutral third-person pronouns, and found that phrases like "they are a doctor" got translated into "he is a doctor, but they are a nurse" was "she is a nurse" in English consistently. And so now they've actually done some correction on that. And when you're translating into a gendered situation like this, Google Translate will give you multiple options. So it'll have both pronouns, although not a neutral one yet, even though English has that. It's when you look at like all of these hiring and what Roberta was talking about earlier with parole and the justice system, and all of the ways that we identify ourselves as members of a group has a lot to do with our language and how we talk about ourselves. So it's not, when you're dealing with language, you cannot pretend to not see the other parts of a person.
And we have a question from the audience. So how does the tool handle multiple languages?
So far, we've only looked at Swedish and English, which happen to have these like nice characteristics that we can identify gender in third person reliably through pronoun use, or pronouns as a proxy is pretty good. We don't know about other languages, but we're really interested in finding out.
Great. So that's there's a call to action right there. If you have some other languages in your repository, please share with this team. I also saw, not to distract us, but someone asked a really important question, which was the name of your cat. So before we go any further, I think we need to answer that.
This is Morot. Their name means carrot in Swedish. And they're about 4 months old, so they're very energetic.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, so you did touch on some of the asks from this group. So can we just dig in a little bit deeper into that, if you don't mind? Just go back to that slide maybe and talk through some of those specific asks. Perfect.
Yeah. So in terms of testing for method, collectively, the three of us speak 4 or 5 languages pretty well, and we're native speakers of both English and Swedish. So we can reliably interpret the results in those languages because we have the cultural context and understanding of like what these words mean in relation to gender. But we don't have that in other languages, and we don't necessarily have that for all like aspects of identity that we might want to investigate. So for example, someone who's more of an expert in race in particular contexts would be much more qualified to make these interpretations because the output we get is basically lists of words and documents.
Right. Good point. So is this something that could potentially, if we have more languages in the repository, is this something that could be have a global impact, or can you explain just more about
absolutely.
like how
So the goal is that we can develop this tool that will let people who are trying to build these AI solutions, who want to do good and help people, to kind of audit what their data is and see what's in there and what might be a problem. So the more people pick it up and use it, and the more people find it useful for their language and their application and the questions they have about their data, the greater the impact it can have.
Amazing. We have a really awesome potential collaboration in the chat. So from Alexander, he says that he would connect you to a group in Africa called Masakane, and they have 10 plus African languages that are being prepared for NLP right now. So that's an exciting connection. I know we have yeah, wonderful. I know we have maybe like 1 or 2 more minutes, but is there anything that you want to ask the audience, like in terms of feedback or just any outstanding questions that you're wondering?
I mean, is this something you would use?
That is a really good question. So actually, in your mind, from on your team's end, who do you think would be the user of a tool like this?
When we first started looking at it, we were talking about what in the, because this is part of my thesis work. So we were talking about what the knowledge gap is in the field academically. And it seems that a lot of people look at methods to debias algorithms or to measure bias in algorithms. And not a lot of people, even though there's this acknowledgement that it seems to stem from the data, not a lot of people try to look at the data and to interrogate it using, like, I guess, more humanities-based methods of what's actually in here and what does that mean. So that felt like something that we could contribute. And in investigating it, when we started doing the proof of concept, we realized that if people actually used this, and if it turns out to be a nice complement to other debiasing methods where you can pull things out that you don't want to teach your AI, just like you wouldn't want your toddler exposed to it, then maybe that has a greater impact. So then that became more of a, how can we make this something that's available for people who are working on developing NLP tools and solutions.
Wonderful. Okay, I can't believe time's up already, but if you want to use this tool, please reach out to Hannah, or if you know anyone that would want to collaborate on this work, reach out to Hannah and team via Slack. We will share that in the chat. And thank you so much for sharing this incredibly urgent project with the group here today. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Caroline for the next introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. And it almost sounds like these projects can collaborate with each other, not just with everyone in the audience. So it's really exciting to see the group all together today. Our last project for the day comes from the Future of Food team, Radiant Earth Foundation, led by Dr. Hamed Al-Muhammad. Radiant Earth aims to address the theme of using AI to develop a more complete picture about the social, ecological, and nutritional impact of our daily food choices. Dr. Hamed works with a team including Amber Mayers, Louisa Nakanuko Diggs, and Kevin Booth. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to him to give us an overview of his project, Radiant Earth, and then open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here representing our team and presenting our project on building a sustainable food system using Earth observations. As we all know, and it has been discussed throughout this summit, agriculture has a significant environmental footprint from emissions of greenhouse gases and exacerbation of the climate change, land degradation, to extensive use of fertilizers and pesticides, which pollutes our natural resources, and also overexploitation of many of these resources, like our groundwater system. At the same time, we are not meeting many of our global challenges around food security, farmer profitability, and also the general sustainable development goals like zero hunger and no poverty. The underlying problem in this, as we have identified and we are trying to address in this project, is that many of the agricultural practices are not planned based on the natural constraints. And to be more specific, we are not growing crops where it is ecologically and environmentally optimal to do that. Basically, we are trying to address the question of how can we be more efficient about what we grow, where we grow, and how we grow these crops. This is a global problem, so we need global view, and that's why we are using satellite data, which is advanced during the last several years, particularly the last decade, both from the commercial sector and the government sector, and it provides this massive amount of data at global scale to address such a problem. Cloud computing that is enabling us to consume this petabyte of data, AI and machine learning, because this is a very complex problem in terms of detection and classification, and there is evidence of using that to tackle such problems. So we are going to combine these technologies, and crowdsourcing and citizen science on the ground, which is going to help us to collect data on the ground in terms of referencing our algorithm and also validating the outputs of our solution. Our solution is basically an analytics-based decision-making system. The first module will start with mapping existing cropland locations. So using satellite data and AI, we are going to detect what we are growing now as the status quo. We need to meet that demand. Even if we are going to change our cropping system, we need to keep the existing production level. But we also need to optimize for future scenarios. And that is where the second part of the project comes in, to generate these scenarios of what is the optimal constraint, what is the optimal production level and cropping system for meeting our environmental constraints. What about if we want to have a future production level, meeting our basically increasing demand from the population growth? And what would be the optimal scenario given the changing climate? Because that is going to impact the optimality of growing crops in different parts of the world. These scenarios will be basically an optimal cropping pattern that will ensure a maximum yield, at the same time meeting our environmental constraints, so we can have a sustainable agricultural system moving forward. The output of this project will have impacts in several sectors. On the social and human side, more resilient and nutritious crops, which is going to also improve human health, more increased yield and opportunities to thrive for small and women-owned farms. On the environment side, better conservation practices, less toxins and pollutions in the environment, and resilience to shocks, stress, and also impacts of climate change in the future. On the economic side, reduced farming and management expenses, and a more reliable income for farmers, and particularly smallholder farmers who are going to benefit from this system. Based on our existing work the last year or so, we are targeting a 2-year project to expand this and run it at a regional level, 6 countries in East Africa. This 2-year will basically include the data collection, capacity building efforts with farmers, and also the model development and validation, and at the end, assessment of our output through that farmer and network that we are going to build. We look forward to partnerships in country to connect with farmers and also existing data and potential funding resources to scale this project up. With that, I thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Hamid. I want to pick up on one of the slides you had about the impact socially, economically, and environmentally. And can you tell us more specifically how your project can play a part in transforming food systems as they operate? So what is your footprint on food systems transformations?
Very good question. Thank you. So the way food systems are working at this time are not necessarily looking at it at a regional or global level. There are many other kind of inputs that goes into, okay, what we are growing now in this location. There are historical practices. A farmer and their family have been growing specific crops in a region, and they're trying to do that. There are many existing efforts to improve those, but they are very much focused on financial impacts and also providing resources to the farmers to increase the yield without thinking about the environmental impact of it. So the main impact actually is how can we use these resources more efficiently and more optimally, because our natural resources are constrained. We can have more of those. And the target and the goal is how can we better use this so we can meet our basically growing population demand for more food. We don't have more land to grow. We have consumed majority of our arable land throughout the world. The remaining piece, which is around, I think we can expand around 20% or so, is mostly actually in Africa. But still, if we don't use that in a kind of a environmentally sustainable way, we are again going to meet the same problem that we are meeting now in a decade or so. So the impact is really at the regional and global level to meet our growing need for food, at the same time being sustainable with using our natural resources.
Great, that is really wonderful. And another question, picking up on, again, Sasha's presentation earlier, because a part of the data collection process, you rely on crowdsourcing and collecting data from the field. So how does your project ensure relevant voices are being heard and incorporated into your technology afterwards?
Very good question. So the way we have worked for the first year project that we have had is we work exclusively with partners on the ground. So we are a small team. We are not in country, but we rely on those partnerships who are actually employing and also educating local staff and local basically talent. They are contributing to this ecosystem of open data and also learning and getting exposure to the technologies and what they can do with this basically open data. Our mindset while we work on many of these projects and we collaborate is that at the end, they need to work on the local problems and provide local solutions. We are not providing solutions for them. We are helping and supporting them to be empowered and use these technologies. So this is just a snapshot of the existing partnerships we have with various organizations, both on the basically funding side and also those on the ground and data collection side. So the short answer is basically working with partners on the ground who are working with local talent and local entrepreneurs so that they can be empowered to build solutions using these data.
Great. And one follow-up question to that from the crowd is, are you looking at mechanisms to incentivize data collection? So other than partnering with boots on the ground, are you also thinking of incentive models for either farmers to contribute data or other partners to come on board?
Absolutely. We have looked into that. We haven't kind of operationalized it. And I think this is one of the parts we would love to have more contribution and partnership from the community, ideas around that. We know it should be a two-way system, so we need that incentive for the farmers while ensuring the privacy. So we have worked on the technology solutions, how we can ensure the privacy while having open data policies. But doing that incentivization and providing pipelines for farmers and other citizen scientists who want to contribute data is where we would love to get more partnership and feedback from the community. So yeah, we're working on that, but any ideas, any partnerships, we would welcome that.
Great. I'm sure folks in the crowd are going to reach out to you for partnerships. Another question from the crowd as well. We've seen a few projects mentioned federating learning models. Are you looking at that at all? And maybe the person who asked the question can clarify federated learning models.
Yeah, if they can elaborate in this context what they mean by that, I would appreciate, and then happy to answer
of
that.
course, we'll ask for a clarification. And until that happens, you started talking about some of your needs and specifically looking at partnerships for data collection. If we can go back to that slide on needs and expand a bit, what other specific needs you'd like to invite the community to contribute?
Yes, thank you. So we have basically grouped our needs to four groups. One is on the funding side. So doing this 2-year pilot, we are looking for about 1.8 million in funding, which will help us both on the capacity building and the data collection on the ground, as well as the kind of hiring new team members and helping with the data and model development. We are looking for partnerships with organizations who can help us go and connect with more farmers on the ground in this region. Organizations who have also expertise in what we call behavioral change, because providing these recommendations to the farmers and basically asking them to adopt a new cropping system, it is not just a technology solution, it is also a social interaction. So we need definitely expertise and networks in that region. On the talent side, we'll love to expand our team on the ML and software engineer. We have existing basically expertise in that domain, but we need to expand that, and the funding will also help with that. On the data side, we're particularly working and looking for any existing data and catalogs that have data sets around crop type, field location, as well as the timestamps of planting and harvesting. We have already collected data in 3 countries, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, but we would love to expand that. We need more diverse data, definitely, and also in the other 3 countries for the pilot phase.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the person who clarified their question. It's actually a question that also was asked to Grow Next about access to data. So the question is, are you allowing access to distributed data sets without handing the actual data over to a common either repository or anything like that? Yeah,
so we actually have a repository of kind of distributed data sets called Radian ML Hub. You can go to mlhub.earth, the link at the bottom of this slide. We have both the repository and also guidelines and best practices and standards about how we should do and how we can do these things better. We have developed these also in collaboration with different members of the community. But Radian ML Hub is basically an open access repository for discovering and also hosting training data sets in this space. And it is not centralized that everything should be in one place. It is federated. Data can sit on any repository or cloud storage, but they have the similar kind of metadata standard that they can be served through the same API. So users would interact the data through the same API and search engine, but the data is hosted in various locations and resources around the globe.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that last question. And maybe before we transition to Andrew, any last words for the audience about this project or anything you want to leave the audience with before we close?
Yeah, I'm going to leave them with the fact that I briefly mentioned that we don't have an unlimited natural resources. We need to preserve our environmental resources. We need to be more basically focused on this problem. And the solution is we need a regional and global problem. This is not a kind of national level problem. We need to think about it as a globally connected, basically, population and community. And the solution that we are proposing is that keeping in mind that environmental constraint and providing solutions that would help us to do this as a global community. So I would welcome any opportunity with the participants and the basically attendee here who are willing to contribute, willing to propose ideas or link us to other organizations or partners who can support this project. So thank you, and I appreciate your participation.
Thank you, Hamid, and great call to action as we come to an end of the first day. Thank you again, Hamid and team. Please reach out to Hamid or the Radiant Earth team on Slack if you have any resources you'd like to contribute or if you'd like to collaborate with the team. And now it's time for me to hand this over to Andrew again, who will share some closing remarks.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to all of the project teams who shared these very interesting projects with us. I think we've identified a number of different collaboration points across the various discussions. As Caroline said, let's keep those going in the Slack channel because we obviously couldn't get to everything, and that's a chance to connect with each of these project teams and those individuals. So let's keep that conversation going. XPRIZE does also have a platform we call the Marketplace we've used successfully on our Pandemic Alliance. We will be serving that up as we close out the breakthrough tracks this week. More to follow on that, but it'll be another way in which you can collaborate around these projects. But we're all just trying to find ways that we can take these inspirational projects and make them even more successful than the work that's already been done. So we appreciate everybody's help on that. We're not done yet, though. Tomorrow, we will hear from the 4 other projects that were part of these final set to be taken through the breakthrough tracks. So we will kick it off again with another compelling keynote, and then take it into a similar format as what we had today for the 4 remaining projects. So really hope everybody here can come back tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, as well as getting your inputs on those other projects will surface. So with that, I'll thank you for your time. I will hand it back to Xenia at ITU to finish us off here.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you all the facilitators for your great job and also great questions. And of course, we would like to thank all the speakers and project presenters for your insights. As Andrew mentioned, we would like to invite all our attendees to join us tomorrow for the second part of the project presentation that will be preceded by the keynote address by Joshua Benjo, his ACM/AM Turing Award laureate and also the founder and scientific director at MILA Quebec AI Institute. So if you would like to join us tomorrow, please register on the website and you can see all the details right now in the chat. We would like to also thank all our partners, sponsors, and our co-convener Switzerland for your continuing support. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you tomorrow.
Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector.